Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today's episode of Legal Tea is the Cautionary Tales topic. And on these Cautionary Tales episodes of Legal Tea, we normally talk about real life cases that are things me or my office have worked on, or they are things that I think are just generally good things to be aware of so that you do not turn into a cautionary tale on this podcast one day. Well, today we are going to be talking about a case where someone failed to get their living trust funded. And it's a really great follow-up to last episode. And if you listened to it, it was the episode on Muhammad Ali. And I wrapped that episode up with some general thoughts about trusts. And I said that one of the things that's a very vital part of a process when creating a trust is called funding. So today's story is about someone, let's call her Betty. Betty created a trust, and little Miss Betty threw many of our letters that we sent her on her kitchen counter. She didn't do anything with them, and she ended up passing away very unexpectedly. Unfortunately for Betty and her family, her choice of not acting on any of our letters and, any of our communications actually, created a massive mess, and her estate took years to get administered and closed up. Starting at the very beginning, Betty embarked on her estate planning journey, and ultimately through that process, she elected to do a type of a living trust. Now, when I'm trying to explain a trust to a client and what it is and how it works, I often describe a trust as like a bucket. And you take your assets and you put them in your bucket. So what that means, kind of more logistically and legally speaking, things will come out of your name and they will go into the name of your trust. So because assets are now in the name of the trust, they have to operate by what the trust says. So that process of taking assets out of your name and putting them in the name of your trust or the bucket is called funding. As I always jokingly tell people, it's called funding, not because it's fun, but because it's necessary. So back to Betty. So Betty signs her trust, and after that, it was time to discuss a funding strategy, a funding plan. So the attorney and Betty set the funding plan, and we were going to be changing ownership of some assets, changing the trust to be the beneficiary of other assets. And I often say that the funding process is equally as important as signing the trust document itself. Because if you do not fund the trust is a big old pile of paper that may not do what you're trying to do and accomplish. At the same time, though, the funding process always takes two to tango. And what I mean by that is there's involvement from the attorney and the client. So the attorney will be instrumental in getting a trust funded. Like if I use my office, for example, we usually prepare and record deeds for properties like a house. We prepare what we call letters of instruction for bank accounts. We usually obtain and complete forms for assets like life insurance and retirement accounts. Or if they have, say, like an active financial advisor, we will work with him or her to get titles, nice and updated as, part of the overall plan and strategy. You get the point. Nonetheless, or maybe the point is there are things that the client has to do and the attorney could be helping them do. So because some people want or need accountability to get homework done, my office at least, and I'm not sure about other offices, but my office at least, we have developed a process for funding where we send out what we call reminder letters. So if a few weeks go by and we have not received things back from the client, we will send a letter and say, hey, do not forget about, XYZ assets. Here's what we have that is still not complete. And we will list the specific assets in kind of next actions. We have 3 reminder letters that go out like this to hold them accountable and honestly and transparently to protect us as well. Because if they do not do their homework, I do not want the client's family mad at us. So through the process as well, we also call the client, to help keep them moving along. We try to schedule meetings to keep them moving along. So with Betty, a first reminder was sent, and a second reminder, and a third one. And after a client fails to communicate at all, a final letter is eventually sent to them and basically says, hey, we have tried and tried and tried to get a hold of you, and you haven't responded at all. And from that, we turn around and usually stop actively working on their funding. After all, I don't think any rational person would think that, us doing the same thing over and over and over again and getting the same result of no response from the client is fair to us. We just simply can't do our job without the client's communication and cooperation. And that's exactly what happened with Betty. 3 letters were sent asking for her to participate and communicate. And as a last-ditch effort, we attempted to call her a couple times after those 3 letters. And would you know it, on the second attempt, she picked up. So we ended up scheduling a meeting for her to come in and sort of help regroup. At the meeting, she was totally rational and she took the blame. And she was just like, life's been busy, Jenny. And funny, she was retired. She was in her late 60s, I believe. But she had such a good heart, and she volunteered more than anyone I've ever known. So between life and volunteering and hanging out with family and grandkids, she just kind of came clean, and she said she'd just been throwing our letters on the kitchen counter and just had not gotten to them yet. The meeting was fine and pleasant, and it was really good to see her and catch up. After that meeting, would you believe me if I said we basically did the exact same song and dance again? We got nothing but silence from her. And the reminder letters started again, 3 more letters, and nothing. So we can lead a client to the water, but it's up to them to drink it at some point, right? The next time we heard anything about Betty was that she died. Some time passes, the family calls to get scheduled to come in for a meeting to kind of talk about what's next, what legally speaking needs to be done now that she's passed away. I remember all of us at the office were kind of on pins and needles thinking, we hope her family isn't coming in with boxing gloves on. Surely they'll understand that we tried and tried and tried to get her mom's trust funded. Well, the family got to the meeting and they were so apologetic, saying, we're so sorry. We found your guys' letters sitting on mom's kitchen counter, and we have to assume that she didn't do anything that you asked her to do. So we start diving into where her assets are, how they're titled, what beneficiaries are on them. And boy, we sure had no idea what we were walking into. What we proceeded to discover over the next few weeks and months after having to do some investigating and, communicating with various companies was that Betty had her assets all over the place. The issue with this is her trust had a very specific distribution pattern. We had talked for a long time about what she wanted, very extensively. And sadly, because there were very few assets in her trust, in her bucket, the trust distribution pattern would not govern a majority of her assets. So some of Betty's assets had some of her kids on some of the assets, some of her other kids on other assets. She had grandkids who were in their teens and early 20s on assets. And her trust, she had the kids inheriting totally equally. She even had some provisions in place to still have money go to her grandkids, but in a way that they would not control their inheritance if they were young, like they were. So needless to say, it was a mess. Ultimately, the family and the office got through it, It felt like every time we turned, there was some sort of hurdle we had to overcome. And it was kind of the classic take one step forward, two steps back. The entire process was like that, which of course is a very inefficient and frustrating all around way to deal with the legal stuff. Though, had Betty locked arms with us to get through the trust funding process, this likely would have never happened. But because she did not, we, the family and our office, were left to clean things up. So what can we learn from this case? First, I think it's important to understand that if you have a trust or want a trust as part of your estate plan, please, please, please make sure the funding gets done. As you can tell by this case, and like I said earlier, it's one thing to create and sign the trust document, but it's a whole separate and, different vital part of the process of creating a trust is to work with the attorney to set a plan on assets, on how they're supposed to be owned and beneficiary designated, and then actually move the assets accordingly. That's the actual funding process. Second, another thing to know about having or doing a trust as part of an estate plan is I obviously recommend working with an estate attorney. But something to watch out for is that not all attorneys help you fund your trust. Like I said at the very beginning, the funding process always takes two to tango. And what I mean by that is that my office will be instrumental in getting a trust funded, but we can't do it all. Though there are many law firms out there that barely, if at all, talk about the importance of funding and emphasize the importance of funding and what specifically needs to be done and who is doing each action, and providing accountability to attempt to get the T's crossed and I's dotted. I have a lot of pride in my office in this regard because we try to do everything we can to help a client get their trust funded. But a lot of attorneys will set the funding plan and tell the client, good luck, it's on you now, buddy. It's on you now at this point. And honestly, from a business perspective, I can kind of see why they do that. The funding process is a doozy. My office, we have a whole team that helps clients get their funding done. Of course, all the members of that team have to get paid. They have various HR benefits, etc. So if an attorney is looking for a way to shave business expenses, that's an easy way to shave some expenses right there. And actually, one last comment sort of on this is if you're price shopping attorneys to do your estate plan, and say one attorney is somewhat dramatically cheaper than another, it may be because they're not helping you fund the trust. So really, you think you're comparing apples to apples, but you're not. You're actually comparing apples to oranges. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now and shift to a sneak peek of next week, which we are circling back to the current trends topic, where we talk about things that are going on currently that impact my estate and elder law world, or maybe they're things that I have stumbled upon on the news or social media that are just relevant to this podcast. So we'll dive into a current trends topic next week, Legal Tea listeners. Until